This summer, we've been seeing unprecedented flooding in various countries around the world, including Pakistan, the U.S., and even South Korea. With unprecedented levels of rainfall, not only has there been damage to buildings and facilities resulting in economic losses, but the human cost of these disasters have been devastating across societies. We take a look at why we've seen worsening levels of rain and what actions are needed to reduce the impact of future disasters. For this, we are joined by Dr. Richard Steiner, Professor and Director of Oasis Earth, and Alexander Matheou, Regional Director for Asia Pacific of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, first, Dr. Steiner, what are the main drivers behind this unusually heavy rainfall?
First of all, to you on your term unprecedented is absolutely correct. We've been using that a lot over the last few years. There are two main physical factors. One is increased evaporation of water from the sea surface, from warmer oceans and warmer air holding more water vapor. And then secondly, the instability in the jet stream caused by climate change. And both of these will get worse. The physics are very straightforward and very clear. Warmer ocean waters at the sea surface, warmer air over that holds millions of tons more water in the atmosphere than, say, 30 or 40 years ago. And then secondly, with the pressure differential changing between the poles and the equator, the jet streams, those four main rivers, huge rivers of air, 5 to 10 miles off the planet's surface, are slowing down and becoming more unstable. So these rivers of air also transmit billions of tons of water. And if they stall, you can have an excessive severe rain event for extended periods of time. So we've got those two physical effects going on, and we do know it will get worse over the next few decades.
Right, and we've seen some very unprecedented, like you said, situations. And Director Matheou, I understand you were recently in Pakistan. How did your organization respond to the flooding crisis there?
Well, the response is still going on, and it will go on for a long time, actually. There are multiple crises happening at the same time, depending on which part of the country you were in and what the level of water in that part of the country. So the water came crashing down, smashing bridges, smashing roads, smashing houses, moving through to the south of the country where the water is actually now stuck. So in Sindh province, it's around the same level of the sea, and the water has nowhere to go. And we're not sure how long the water will be standing there. And 5 to 6 million people have been displaced from their homes. Some of them are still trapped. They can't be reached or only through helicopter or boat. Others are beginning to return to their homes where the water has receded. The places I visited where the water has begun to recede, although people are still wading into their homes waist deep, but some of the houses are now accessible. The conditions are pretty dramatic. Everything is destroyed. The fields are destroyed where people relied on crops for their livelihood. There's nothing to cook or nothing to cook with, and people are drinking very dirty water. So people are getting sick very quickly at the moment. And that is where the water is receding. The biggest concern actually is where people are still trapped and are not accessible, and where lives really will be lost actually in the coming days and weeks unless that water goes down or unless there's some way to find them. So it's a very dramatic humanitarian situation in Pakistan. We're responding with the basics, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, with the Pakistan Red Crescent, food, water, medicine, shelter, mostly relying on what is currently in stock in country. The international assistance is being flown in as we speak, but it is nowhere near enough. The scale of the disaster, 5 to 6 million people displaced, 30 million people affected. And the numbers actually are not really to be relied on in terms of how many people have lost their lives. I know people are quoting around 1,200, but in fact the number is almost surely far higher and will continue to grow. So it's a huge task we are facing, both in the immediate term and in the longer term for recovery.
Well, it's really heartbreaking to hear all that, and I'm sure the work is still going on. But Dr. Steiner, I want to turn to you. Did climate change play a role in the Pakistan monsoon that resulted in the severe flooding that we just heard about?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's playing a role in just about everything. One of the main mechanisms by which climate change is affecting human economies and civilization and the biosphere is through the movement of water, the change in the hydrologic cycle by adding so much heat to the atmosphere and to the ocean surface. We have essentially supercharged and accelerated the hydrologic cycle. So millions of tons of more water are in the atmosphere flowing on these four jet streams from west to east across the planet's surface. And when these jet streams stall out or raise over mountains, they drop an enormous amount of water. This was predicted decades ago. We know this is going on. The physics are very straightforward, and it's going to continue going on and actually getting worse. So, yeah, and the problem, too, is, of course, what Mathew's group points out is that these things affect different social groups, people that can least, respond disproportionately so. There's over 2 billion people globally that are within flood risk zones. Many of those are some of the most impoverished people in the world, hundreds of millions of people. And when poverty and flood risk overlap, it's certainly a recipe for disaster, which we're seeing to some extent in Pakistan and other places today.
Right, some certain demographics are more exposed to this type of natural disasters. We'll get back to that later on. But first, before that, Director Matheou, we always react to these weather-related disasters. But is there something we can do to prevent severe flooding and its, devastating impact?
There are things that can be done to mitigate its impact, for sure. And we do have good examples around the world of countries that have developed, for a start, good early warning systems. Our ability to predict at least rainfall and flooding is much better than it used to be. That is a huge advantage. It allows people to know in advance that they should move into higher ground, find ways to protect their livelihoods from the flooding. And if you look at one close example to Pakistan, in Bangladesh, the numbers that would lose their lives during flooding in the past is far lower now because they have good early warning systems and good shelters on high ground for people to go to. The quality of housing, the quality of dams, the management of dams, the quality of embankments, all of those things do make a big difference. And that should be part of how countries plan for managing cyclical floods. It does matter, though, the point that Dr. Steiner just made, that some of the people who are most vulnerable are the least able to adapt. They live in lowlands, flood-prone areas, because that's the only place they can live. They rely on subsistence agriculture in what is, in a non-flooding season, a good place to plant. They have limited ability to relocate. They don't have access to transport. And they don't have the ability to survive for long without their livelihoods because they don't have savings. These people are extremely vulnerable, and that's what we're seeing in Pakistan at the moment. The geography doesn't help that if there is no high ground to go to, and if you don't have transport, your options are very limited. In Sindh, while the water is still standing, there isn't a lot of choice for people to go to higher ground. The only structures that are a bit higher than ground level are the highways, which is why you see hundreds of thousands of people now living on highways. But you can imagine how difficult it is to cope. There's no food, water, medicines on those highways, and many of them are cut off, and therefore they can't be accessed. So there are mitigating measures you can take, for sure, on infrastructure, on early warning, but there are people who can't adapt as well if they are chronically vulnerable.
Right, and Director Matheou has briefly touched upon this aspect as well, but Dr. Steiner, what effect does flooding have on the freshwater ecosystem?
Well, it's a paradox in a sense because natural, healthy river systems flood. And they have floodplains and they expand their boundaries and flood into the delta with, different seasonal precipitation levels and such like that. The problem is when you have excessive flooding and all this human development down next to the river corridor, within the river corridor and deltas, then you've got a lot of humans exposed to to these flooding disasters. The ecosystem, the biggest, possibly the biggest ecosystem impact would be the flood of pollutants from these industrial sites and human habitations back into the river system from these floods. So that's a difficult one to manage, but it's certainly a real impact.
Right, and as Director Matheou has said, there are a certain group of people that are more exposed to the impacts of the flooding. So Dr. Steiner, I want to touch upon how do climate-related disasters affect certain social groups disproportionately? We can elaborate on what you were saying before.
Yeah, I think Matheou has laid that out, and it's pretty well understood right now that the poor are disproportionately impacted by many impacts of climate change, not just flooding, but also drought, food insecurity, transportation systems, the economic opportunities they have in front of them. But the same is certainly true for flood risk. As Matheou said, a lot of people have settled into these areas in these massive river deltas and river corridors because that's the only place they could live. And these are all flood prone. And every nation in the world needs to update its flood maps and its climate risk assessments to understand where these increasing flood events are going to impact most. And we've got to be smart about this and start making the investments in the climate resilience and flood resilient infrastructure. And that is something we've all known about for years, but governments have been unwilling to actually make the investment. And there's ways to do that we could mention here in a minute, but this is a multi-trillion-dollar challenge we have globally, primarily in the impoverished, developing, and the poor and the middle-income countries. They need money to make these changes and these climate resilient infrastructure changes. And we here in the G20, the developed world, that are largely responsible for the climate crisis, need to put that money up.
Right, and Dr. Steiner, to add to that, what are some areas that are more susceptible to these climate changes? Certain regions that you'd like to warn?
Sure, certainly South Asia. We're talking about Pakistan right now, where I've worked for the government there years ago. Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, then in East Asia, China, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, all those areas are somewhat prone to flooding disasters. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, and these areas that I've just mentioned, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, Congo, the Niger Delta, also where I've worked, are very impoverished as well. So a lot of the people there, as Matheou mentioned, do not have the ability to respond and adapt and or even to really authentically prepare for these flood disasters. They're kind of living on a shoestring to start with. So we know where these risks are. We know they're going to increase, and we know how to make these communities and these cities and these civilizations more climate resilient, but we just have to get government behind putting the investment in to do that. And one way to do that is with a global minimum carbon tax. The G20 passed a global minimum corporate tax last year of 15%. That's great. But now they need to pass a much more important, in my mind, global minimum carbon tax and use those funds to accelerate the transition to low carbon energy systems, and most importantly, to fund the global carbon fund to several $1 trillion a year to support these 175 other nations that really are desperate for our assistance, and they were not the cause of the crisis to start with. So I think we have a moral and political and self-interest obligation to help financially.
Now, Director Matheou, do you have anything to add to that? Like, what strategies should governments pursue to increase the climate resilience of people and nature?
Well, as Professor Steiner says, first there needs to be a plan, but there is a genuine challenge around financing it if it's very expensive. There are some low-cost things, as I mentioned, that can make a huge difference. The effective use of early warning. We saw that actually in Pakistan, that it was better than last time. Both the formal communications from the government, but also local mosques and communities advising people to leave early. And most of the people I met did leave early, and they have come back to destroyed homes, but their animals are alive and their family is alive because they moved to higher ground. I visited one household that didn't heed the early warning, tragically. They just had a baby boy a week before, and they waited too long thinking that they would be okay, and the water rose very, very quickly. The mother tried to escape, clutching the newborn, and it was swept, and the child was swept away. So the country is full of these tragedies, especially if the early warning is not listened to. So getting early warning to be communicated well and understood well, it makes a huge difference. Having shelters on high ground to keep people and livestock safe is critical. The investment in infrastructure is critical, but there are some other ones that will be more complicated. The relocation of communities that can no longer live safely in flood-prone areas is going to be extremely difficult and probably, strange as it may sound, not popular with the communities themselves who are at risk because of limited choice and because there are some agricultural advantages in living in flood-prone areas that matter to people. And then there is the population size issue. And the more a population grows, the more people living in high-risk areas, the more people at risk, and that is another huge challenge for the world to cope with.
Right, it's heartbreaking to hear those specific stories as well, but I'm afraid this is where we're going to have to cut it short because of the time, and that was Dr. Richard Steiner, Professor and Director of Oasis Earth, and Alexander Matheou, Regional Director for Asia Pacific for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.